Dom, what's up with the baseball cap? I'm just gonna go straight there. That's new.
I told you I was having I was having a bad hair day, and I went
It
through
happens to all of us, even those
yes,
of
I
us
had
with
a
very little hair.
it was just flat, and it was pissing me off. So I'm like, you know what? When in doubt, put a baseball cap on it.
I
Put a cap
listen,
on it.
I'm a believer in that one. All right. Well, listen, we've got a lot to get to once
Yeah, we
again,
do.
and I think a very fascinating interview. So let's start the show. Hi, I'm Jenna,
And I'm Dom, and we're both award winning journalists.
who've recently been laid off.
Our industry is experiencing a seismic shift, and it's shed a lot of really good journalists.
So where does that leave us? Well, we're definitely laid off.
And we're looking for new jobs, looking for what's left of the industry, and what to do next.
And we're looking at all of it. So if you're a fellow laid off journalist, a working journalist, or someone who admires the craft, we're looking to build community.
Develop new skills, and try to figure out what just happened.
Welcome to Laid Off and Looking. Okay, so we mentioned last week that big changes were coming to the behemoth, or I guess what was behemoth of CNN. And then yesterday on Twitter, it happened.
I just wanted to end today's show by thanking all of the wonderful people who work behind the scenes at this network. You may have seen some reports about me and the show. And after giving all of this some careful consideration and weighing an alternative time slot CNN offered me, I've decided to move on. One final message. Don't give in to the lies. Don't give in to the fear. Hold on to the truth and to hope. Even if you have to get out your phone, record that message. I will not give in to the lies. I will not give in to the fear.
And first of all, I will admit I have not been a voracious cable news watcher like I used to be when I was younger. So I can't say that I've seen all of his work, but I am sad to see Jim's like another one of those anchors that's just always been there. And so it kind of feels like the end of an era with him departing.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, I went down this, of course, the YouTube rabbit hole of looking up his old videos
Oh
of
boy.
him combating with then President Trump back in like 2017, 2018. And it's like I forgot who put together like a super clip of him, super cut of him fighting with Trump. And it was really funny just seeing how they went back and forth. And I guess the big moment was the one where Acosta got into this big argument with Trump that where Trump basically told him, he called him a rude man, and he called him, then he also said that CNN was, of course, fake news, and
Yes.
it was
Was that
so
before?
uncomfortable.
Yes, yes. I'm thinking, I was gonna say, was that before or after he superimposed him like body slamming CNN on like WW, whatever it
That
was?
I don't, that I don't know, but it was basically, it was over the fact. What was it? Hold on, as I just want to make sure I get this all correctly. But it was, I think it was during their exchange of, yeah, Trump was defending his characterization of the migrant caravan as an invasion,
Oh,
and
right.
then he called Jim Acosta a rude, terrible person. So, um, yeah, I mean, I think Jim's calling. I think I like the fact that he's kind of sending out a message, as we said last week, where CNN is making changes. And I think the
Yeah.
impression people are getting is they're looking to have a very different relationship this term with
I think a lot of
uh,
people are.
the president. And I think they want to have this, less combative. And I think there's this message from Jim that it's like, hey, guess what? Um,
A
Still hold
lot
people
of people,
accountable.
it would appear, are looking to have less combative relationships. Now, in the private sector, that might be one thing. Perhaps if you were looking to have a government contract, you might want to adhere to the new government standards and roll back your DEI practices, regardless of what your customer base might think. But to me, that doesn't seem that, not to me, just flat out, that's not the role of the press. The press isn't there to have a more, warmer relationship or etc. And sometimes, yes, when you're holding power to account, that can be combative. It can be uncomfortable. And yeah, it seems
Especially,
as if people are kind of like, but we just don't want to make them mad.
Yeah, and it's like, well, that's too bad. That's,
That's really
I
too
know there are
bad.
people, it's like, I know people want to be like, well, I don't like fact checking because if you fact check me, that means if you tell me I'm wrong and I am wrong, I don't want to admit I'm wrong. And it's like, I hate to tell you, but that's the problem. I mean, we all are held accountable for facts and misstatements and, you know what I mean, disinformation and this is the whole part of being a journalist is to, especially the ones that, the important jobs that they're doing, especially in holding politicians and well, everybody, of course, accountable, but those who are working in that field,
Yeah,
like
but
what Jim
politicians are
Acosta's.
public servants. You have a
Yes,
unique responsibility to be held
yes,
accountable.
yes, yes. It's where the line starts getting blurred when what's more important, business or the truth?
Well,
And
as I told you, somebody, I swear to God, said the business of this business is more about business and less about the news.
so, I mean, what was the vibe online to
So,
Jim's
what
statement?
I thought was really interesting was online, what some of the comments that I was seeing was in his final part of his statement saying,
Hmm.
don't give in to the lies. I'm not going to
Hmm.
give in to the lies, etc. Was people saying, like, wait a second, why are you saying this now? Like on your way out the door, being like, oh, by the way, people are lying. Bye. And um and on one hand, I could see why, not I can see, I completely understand why that is such a sore point of frustration for so many consumers of journalism at this point, to feel like, the journalists themselves are lying to us. I again want to reiterate, I do not believe that is the case. The rules for how you're conducting yourself either on air or what the editorial board is doing, that's going to vary from shop to shop to shop. So I can't
Hmm.
unilaterally
Hmm.
say that, like, oh, all of us, like, no, like at the shops that I've worked at, that hasn't been the case.
Hmm.
But at the same time, if you are not watching everything, and you just like hear one little thing and it seems to stick in the craw of an issue that you feel is really problematic, you're going to hold that up and be like, this is a perfect example. You people like wait to the last minute, to your last day on the job, and then you tell us the real truth. And I don't know. I mean, I kind of understand where people are coming from and why they're saying that, but at the same time, if you look at Jim's body of work, I don't think that's been the
Yeah.
case ever.
No. No. You see, that's the thing. It's like I think that people sometimes look at things and make snap judgments, and that's what happens a lot today, and that's a big part
That's
of the
what online is
problem.
for.
But it is also a responsibility for all of us to go out there and get other opinions and look at things and not just look at things as one sole, like this one instance is the only time that this person's ever said anything. You have to look at the full body of work. And somebody like Jim, who's actually been out there, he's just I think, sending out this message, like I said before, not in his head, but I'm guessing like, hey, if all these changes are happening, hold people accountable. Say, I'm not going to accept a lie just because, we're not doing that. It's not financially, a great decision to like, start challenging people. Like I think, and I think the public needs to kind of look at the individual who's saying it and be like, this guy's been out there, challenging for, he did it for 4 years against,
And also, I
and
would say
beyond.
knowing very clearly knowing the difference between a journalist, a reporter who's on the beat,
Yeah,
etc., and someone
yeah,
who is maybe more of a talk show host that can also be on a
yeah,
news channel, but
yeah.
that it's not the same thing.
It's not the same thing. And
News
we've talked about
analysis and
this.
news opinion. I know I keep coming back to this, but
But
analysis and
Jenna,
opinion isn't the same.
it's so important because people still really don't get it. And I get it sometimes too.
Well,
We
because
fall
they're
prey
all
to it also.
presented, yeah, and they're all
Yes.
presented under the auspice of like, this is all the news on our news channel, and like, well, actually, no, this part is the news that we've brought to you, and now this part, this huge chunk that's going to fill up the rest of the day, this is us giving analysis about the story that's taken place, and then later on in the evening, because now we really want to get your blood boiling or whatever, we've got some people to give opinions about the analysis about the story that started out the day, like,
Yeah.
anyway. I will die
Well,
on that hill.
well, I good luck to Jim and
I'm
you know,
sure Jim's going
yeah.
to be fine.
Yeah. Yeah, you
I don't
mentioned he's
know
on
what that.
Substack, right? You said he's on
Yes, I believe he's
Substack.
on Substack. So, if you ever come across us, Jim, we'd love to
Yeah.
have you. It doesn't
Love
hurt.
it. You're
Never
oh, I
hurts.
love it. Yeah, that's right. Um, I guess I'm switching gears a little bit over here, Jenna. Covering a little bit of a different story for us, but it actually kind of ties into the interview that our spotlight interview that we did. So we're looking at this our the headline that was in People magazine. It's about a case you might have heard of before, the Menendez brothers.
Oh,
You
no, I've
remember?
never heard of that case. Sorry,
I
that was
mean,
one of my
it's
first big news stories.
remember it was like so giving a little bit of background for people. Lyle and Erik Menendez, so they were convicted of murdering their parents, Kitty and Jose, back in 1989.
Hmm.
um, right now the brothers then the brothers claim that they killed their parents out of fear after years of abuse by their dad.
Yeah.
They were sentenced to prison. They've been in prison for like
Life without
35
parole.
years.
They've been in, yeah, for
They've been at for 30,
decades.
I think, yeah, 35 years. So basically, in recent years, there's been a lot of growing support for looking at this case again in different eyes. A lot of it
Well,
having,
because
well,
people have a better understanding of child abuse and the fact that,
exactly,
yes, even little boys too.
exactly. And, but also what had an impact on the case, especially recently, were it was a really big popular, there was a really popular drama series and also a documentary on the brothers on Netflix this past year.
Netflix. Yes, yes.
So there's been basically now been a hearing that's set for March 20th. The family, the family behind the brothers are actually hoping that they'll get released after this
And if
hearing.
I understand, that's the Menendez and Kitty's family. Like they have people from both sides of their family who are like,
Any other, yes,
The
yes,
only thing that sticks in my cross, sorry, very quickly, is that they're
yeah,
like, let the boys out. I'm like, these are grown men now. I understand they were sentenced as young men, but these are grown men now. Can we stop infantilizing white men? Okay. Sorry,
it's
that's
true.
just my TED talk very quickly.
No, and so over here, so I know they said like their cousin Anna Marie Baralt, I think that's how you pronounce the last name, says that they're remaining optimistically cautious. What's interesting also about this is how the media covered this story decades ago, right? Back in like the late 80s, and it happened in 89. So it was 89 and then of
It
course
really kind
through
of
the
kicked off in the
90s.
90s, yeah.
But when you look at how that story was covered and how the media covered that whole case, um, you didn't have social media at that point for people to communicate and say whether or not what they thought. I mean, because I do remember back then there were people who were very sympathetic to the brothers and what happened to them and just fully didn't believe that they did anything wrong. Like they didn't even, there was a point where people didn't even believe they murdered their parents. But there was also the
No,
media and
yeah,
how they portrayed them. Is
that
very
was
different to
problematic. Yeah.
how it looks compared to today. Of course, because there's more, we're much more aware of, like you said, survivors of sexual abuse. We're
Hmm.
much more aware of things of, how we look at these stories, how we talk about them, how we can villainize people. So it really was interesting to see how the media sort of has shifted over the years.
It is. And I think that there's been a renewed interest in not just their case, but I think a lot of those uh, big cases as there's been a renewed interest in all things true crime. I mean, there's been a
Hmm.
renewed interest in, oh God, I feel terrible. Um, Lacey Peterson's husband. There we go.
Scott
Scott,
Peterson.
who's,
Yeah.
yes, also claiming innocence. And there's
Hmm.
been a renewed interest in his case, people also claiming that he really did not do that. There's been, documentaries going over the family murder in Colorado. God, I feel so terrible. I'm forgetting this poor
John
woman's
Benet
name.
Ramsey.
No, not John Benet Ramsey, although there has been renewed interest in that. But that's what I'm saying is that like going back over these cases that then became these explosive, huge media stories and really going back and re-examining like where did we reach the point where maybe the tail was wagging the dog and we had, as the kids say, lost the narrative when it comes
But
to what is actually important here, solving the
but
crime or engaging in the drama.
and I think that's also you mentioned before, like today, we don't just have journalists covering these stories. We have true crime podcasts.
Mm.
And many of them are, some are hosted by journalists, but many are just hosted by regular, and when I say regular people, I mean people who don't have a journalism background and can sometimes that line between truth and fiction kind of
Exploitation.
get sort of blurred. Those lines get blurred, and that can create a lot of confusion. And you're right, exploitation of victims' families.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where a lot of this, of course, this discussion that we had with our guest of talking about their project of the true crime podcast. So let's give a
Which is not intentionally to be a funny, but it's
it's
about it's a podcast
it's
about
very
true
meta.
crime podcasts. And it was a really fascinating conversation with these two young women who dug deep into this genre of podcasting. True crime podcasts are one of the most popular ways to consume crime stories, and the genre is only getting bigger. A recent report by Edison Research and Audiochuck says that 119 million Americans have listened to a true crime podcast, with women making up the largest part of that audience. This fascination with the format is exactly what today's guests, Kylie McPeek and Grace Carroll, set out to explore. Let me try that again because I flubbed a line. One more time. In 3, 2, 1. True crime podcasts are one of the most popular ways to consume crime stories, and the genre is only getting bigger. A recent report by Edison Research and Audiochuck says 119 million Americans have listened to a true crime podcast, with women making up the largest part of that audience. This fascination with the format is exactly what today's guests, Kylie McPeek and Grace Carroll, set out to explore.
In their senior year at Stanford, they co-created the True Crime Podcast, which they both produce and host. What started as a class project grew into an in-depth investigation of true crime podcasts. In their 6-episode series, they explored how these shows shape public views of justice, the ethics of covering real-life tragedies, how they make money, and the fine line between journalism and entertainment. So, what did they discover along the way? Kylie and Grace are here to tell us what they found out. Welcome, guys.
Yes,
Thanks
welcome to
for-
both of you. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having us.
All right. So, first off, I guess what I want to start with, and I'll ask this to both of you, but Kylie, I'll get your take first. What was it that drew you to investigate the ethical and legal implications of true crime podcasts? Because when most people think of true crime, that's the last thing that comes to mind.
I think more and more so, it's not becoming the last thing that comes to mind. I think part of what drew us to this project was we were seeing a lot of kind of meta coverage about the true crime space. As I think true crime grows in podcasting, but also I think in social media, TikTok has become a huge part of the proliferation of true crime. We're starting to see more and more clearly how tricky it can be when normal citizens like ourselves, people who consider themselves content creators in the true crime space, show up to active investigation, active crime scenes, are kind of live streaming their takes on active trials that are going on, and this sense that maybe this isn't always a helpful add to the deliverance of justice. And so, Grace and I were seeing a lot of coverage of when we kind of got this idea, it was the murders in Moscow, Idaho, of 4 college, which maybe just hit close to home for us because we were also college students at the time in like a couple states over from where this crime happened. And it was scary, but also just kind of weird to see how drawn to this kind of layperson sort of coverage of the crime people seem to be. Like, it wasn't people were reading news headlines about this. They weren't consuming journalism about this. They were going to TikTok and podcasts to get their coverage on this crime. And Grace is a journalist. I work in the entertainment space. And to me, it was like, this is like very much in the entertainment sector. And Grace is like, yeah, there's not a lot of traditional ethics from like a journalism standpoint that are being followed and how people are covering this crime. And we weren't the only people looking at this. There's been other sort of journalistic coverage of this meta aspect of true crime podcasting and true crime creating. But that was kind of the genesis of our interest in the project, definitely.
And Grace?
I have a very simple answer to this question, which is Kylie is what drew me to investigate the ethical and legal side of true crime, as she kind of mentioned. I think this story really originated with her, and then she came to me with just what I think was the best pitch I've ever heard for a story. And I was immediately really excited by it. And I consume, and before this project began, had consumed little to no true crime of my own volition. But I think Kylie just presented such a compelling story and such a compelling need for this kind of coverage. And part of that idea, too, was that our final product ought to be in the same sort of genre and in the same format as our sort of site of inquiry, which is to say that ultimately the best way to present this would be a podcast. And I think that aspect was creatively and intellectually really, really interesting to me. To try and engage with this thing kind of on its own terms was really exciting.
Well, I think Dom and I can definitely agree that having a partner in crime makes venturing into this a lot easier.
Totally.
I mean, this
So,
project took us like over 18 months to complete. So
wow.
I think having someone else kind of holding us accountable to each other to actually see it to its end was probably the only reason it's now out and available.
And it
100.
it totally spanned a very sort of changing and unpredictable period of time in our lives too. Because when we started this, we were, students together. And it has carried us now out into our graduation and out into the world. So we kind of entered the world at the same time as this podcast too. So it was definitely nice to be able to be in that, go through that whole journey together.
And so looking at the show, how do you think true crime podcasts, which often mix entertainment and journalism, how did you feel it impacted? Because you did look at this, how it can sometimes impact real criminal investigations, to the real stories that we're hearing.
Yeah, I think it does it on kind of several different levels of kind of when a crime happens to when justice is either delivered or not delivered legally. When a crime has not been solved, when there's an active investigation, there's a lot of interest in a case. And this can be cold cases that were never solved. This often is kind of the center of most true crime podcasts, most true crime stories, most true crime coverage, mostly because there's this need to bring attention to this case in order to get it solved. A real reality of our policing system in the US is that resources are directed towards I think one of our sources when we were interviewing the crimes that people are screaming the most about. So media attention on a case is a really important aspect of how those cases and resources get allocated. And with cold cases, it's kind of when there's not a lot of resources being allocated anymore. So podcasters have decided to pick up the mantle and bring that attention back, get people screaming about it again. And sometimes you'll actually see enough coverage of a case through podcasts, through true crime content, that police do reopen investigations and there is movement on a case. So some people, I think, see this as, part of why people see this as a platform for advocacy is like this idea that we're actually finally delivering justice in cases the police were not able to deliver justice in. And that can totally be true in some cases. But there's also this aspect where there's not really a lot of ethics or regulation or kind of industry norms around what is an okay way to cover a case. And so
Oh my
you'll have
God.
people like ourselves who maybe have never had any real criminal investigation training going in and making accusations or just hypothesizing about who they think might have actually killed someone, which is probably one of the
That is
most
wild.
grim
Mhm.
accusations you can make someone, not just kind of and you can so easily upload this to massive platforms. There's not a lot of guardrails, which is both a merit of podcasting and also I think a drawback when there's all these legal implications, and you'll see defamation suits happen because random citizens are getting accused of horrible crimes, and there's really not a lot of accountability within the industry for that, because that's part of, I think, one of the tropes of the genre is this idea that you're bringing in suspects, and that's why people listen. And I think that's part of the entertainment value of it and what really kind of delineates it from journalism in a lot of ways. And that's just all in the investigation stage. And when, of course, it's a crime that happened recently, the stakes are so much higher because there's already also a lot of police attention on the case usually as well. Things are maybe moving a little bit more quickly, and there's maybe less of an argument for this need to have podcasters come in and bring attention to the case. And then the other part of where our investigation looked at kind of outside of like when active crime scenes are happening or there's an active investigation is when a crime goes to trial. So they've already have ideas about who maybe committed the crime. They're going to try to adjudicate it in our court system. All of us can get called for jury duty. This is just the way our legal system works. It's one of probably the best parts of our legal system is we're all kind of implicated in a way. But because most normal citizens kind of get their understanding of the legal system through true crime entertainment and what people might consider to be more like true journalistic sources, which are true crime podcasts, legal experts are really worried that they're creating all the sort of pretrial bias in jury pools that is going to be more and more impossible to kind of weed out as you're selecting a jury because true crime podcasts are so proliferated. You started this episode with stats, just incredible stats about how many people are listening to this sort of content. And that's really troubling to people who are actually representing criminal defendants, people who are actually evidence experts and people who are studying our legal system. This is like psychologically a lot of bias we're just spreading throughout our population that is going to be really hard to control in what is supposed to be a very controlled space, our criminal like court system, and might have potentially really dangerous impacts for how juries are reaching decisions about homicide trials potentially.
But it's
Grace,
also
I
just
don't want to jump in on anything I missed there,
But I also think it's interesting too, like looking at what happened, look what's happening right now with the Menendez brothers case, where it went from being a case where now you have documentaries, there have been podcasts about it, there's documentaries, they have a series. And now, because of a public outcry, mostly, I guess, a lot of because of podcasts and TikTok too, they're relooking at the case where they might, they might retry and there could be a different outcome. So it shows the power of this medium too, of it can make a big change in someone's life who's whether being accused with, finding out new information, but also the falsely accused, which I know we've also heard of before too.
I mean, that's the genesis of true crime, right? Serial. This is what happened with like the original true crime podcast. And Grace can probably speak to that and the interesting impact of that case.
Yeah, I mean, I think as Kylie points out, one of the most powerful shapes or one of the most powerful sort of story structures we get in the genre of true crime is this innocence project, this idea that it's not that a crime has occurred and we don't know who did it, it's that someone else, there's sort of a secondary injustice where someone has gone to jail for a crime that they did not deserve to be in prison for. And I think Serial was so popular that it sort of like inculcated that format into what then became the true crime industry at large. And the Menendez brothers, I think, Dom, you bring up a really interesting example there because my impression is that outcry, this recent public response, is mostly in response to a piece of what is pure entertainment, which is this fictional Netflix series done by, I'm going to forget his name, but
Ryan
the
Murphy.
show.
Ryan
I
Murphy.
was going to say Dom knows.
Thank you so much. Dom is ready for that. Ryan Murphy, yes, of course, is really associated with a certain, I think, flavor of like camp and sort of high drama fiction, almost in sort of the realm of the soap opera. And I just think what Kylie and I saw over and over again in the true crime industry was this real blurring of the lines between fiction and nonfiction, and how much we are using I don't know, I think as a consumer, how difficult it can be to parse out the difference, like when it matters, what aspects of a story are true and which aspects of them are just a really compelling story. And I also think, as Kylie touched on, we are now living in a media ecosystem and we're living in this technology system, which is going to really, really preference and favor the better told stories. right? And fiction just can run circles around journalism because fiction is not yoked to this rigorous dedication to factuality. And I think in terms of getting people's attention, it's just proven over and over again to have the upper hand. And where we really are, I think, watching journalism lose out to fiction as these forms kind of make them start to
Oh
look
my
similar to
God.
each other.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just journalism losing out to fiction.
I
Like,
know, I
what?
know, I know, I
But I
know.
think what's interesting about podcasts is in kind of this space is like when you're watching the Menendez brothers, like we recognize that it's entertainment. We recognize that parts of it are fiction based on a true story, but it's Javier Bardem on screen. And like we can psychologically connect that to understanding we're watching something entertainment. And maybe it makes us go out and read more about the Menendez brothers case. And certainly there's been a huge public reaction, both positive and negative, to that series. But when we're listening to true crime podcasts, there isn't that same sort of psychological connection that what we're listening to is, at the end of the day, entertainment. The way that it's constructed is actually very similar to these narrative scripts in terms of there's a narrative plot that we're going to follow, and we're going to make it sound like a plot about an investigative journalist who's looking at a case, and we're going to make it sound like nonfiction. In a lot of ways, it is nonfiction, but it's very creative nonfiction. It's very entertaining nonfiction. We're going to parse out our information really slowly so you're hooked. You want to know more. And the source that you're going to go to learn more is this exact podcast that you're listening to, because we've situated ourselves as these like true journalistic experts on this case.
Mhm.
And I think what we discovered in our own research is there's very little within the podcast industry that looks like the journalism industry. When you break down like why people get interested in these cases, why people are listening to these cases, how money flows through this industry, and the incentives of how you put out your content at the end of the day, it's pretty different from journalism. Or maybe the scary thing is it's starting to look less different from journalism as journalism maybe shifts more towards that world. But certainly it feels really dangerous, I think, to Grace and I, that people treat true crime podcasts as journalism nonfiction when it really is, I think, entertainment. And it feels much more similar to what Ryan Murphy is doing than what the New York Times is doing.
I will caveat that a little bit, and because I think it brings up a really interesting sort of idiosyncrasy about the podcasting medium, which is that there is really cool journalism happening in the podcast space. Like something like I think I don't know. I would land on the side of saying something like Madeline Barron's In the Dark, which is coming out of the New Yorker, just put out a new season, which is based off of 4 years of investigative reporting. Like that, I'm very, very comfortable calling journalism in a podcast format because the reporting is there. And I think that's the key piece that people who maybe don't understand how journalism works on the process side can kind of fail to recognize when you're just thinking about this as a consumer. Um, like the finished product between something like an In the Dark and something like a, you know, pretty highly stylized, pretty serious, like high quality true crime podcast can sound really similar. But again, that second example, the sort of like pure entertainment true crime podcast is beholden to none of the same process and reporting standards that something like In the Dark is going to be. But again, it's, you with television and with the visual medium, it's a lot harder to watch a Ryan Murphy show and mistake it for a CNN documentary, right? But with podcasting, those sorts of like genre lines have gotten like really collapsed and kind of disappeared altogether. It's just a really slippery medium, and it's really elastic. It's like really easy to make something sound like something it might not be, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
So there's a sort of element of audio here, which is letting these different pieces of content again just sort of shape shift much more quickly and like much more nebulously than they can with print, or than they can with television, or than they can with these older mediums.
And it's not just how it sounds, too. We actually call them the same genre. We all call them true crime podcasts, and we go on Apple Podcasts and they're on the exact same explore page, and
That's
we're discovering them next to each other. So it's not like a surprise that people might confuse them for each other.
that actually was my I was just thinking like how many people actually know the difference between if they're listening to an entertainment true crime podcast, one where it's just people kind of giving their opinion and are good storytellers, versus people who've actually investigated or are doing that work. And I wonder how many people actually know the difference between those two.
Dom, that's a great question. And that is such a tricky question, I think we found, because it's hard to, how do I even phrase this? Like, you'll hear creators describe themselves as investigators, and what they are describing is Google. What they're describing is Googling something a lot. But again, they're not sort of vetted, or they're not contained within like a journalistic institution in the way that most working journalists are. And so, the only person, there's no checks as to people's legitimacy in the same way that there is in the sort of formal world of journalism. So that's really tricky. And I think, because again, people are sort of self-described and very self-fashioned in the podcasting world in a way that you just really can't be in conventional journalism. And so, as for the consumers, how many people know what they're listening to? I do think, as Kylie mentioned earlier, there is a growing appetite and there is a real interest in audience members to seek out what they think of as, like, quote unquote good true crime. And I just think there's no sort of vetting process for what that is. Again, these systems are selecting for, all these different algorithms, all these different platforms are selecting for often not, rigorous and thorough investigation or fact checkers or, first person interviews or familial consent. They're selecting largely for streaming numbers. So again, there's just no sort of built-in incentives. There's no built-in guardrails in the podcasting industry to help consumers really find those real stories.
Yeah.
You got to do a lot of noise on the way.
It is interesting, though, because I think part of why our own investigation was so successful and why we were able to get so many fans and creators to talk to us throughout our project and our research is there is this growing appetite. People do want to have a real conversation about creating what, quote unquote, ethical true crime. Whether that can exist is maybe a different question, but like, people want true crime that's made in a way that is as like non-harmful as possible. As I think people really do believe in this mission of true crime to be a platform for advocacy. And you see that from creators and fans alike, regardless of whether or not they're actually listening to or making content that can be called advocacy, which is kind of interesting. But I will also say that all, like, kind of surveys done on true crime fans, asking them why they listen to true crime, the number one reason by a long shot is because they find it entertaining. They think it's entertaining. They're not duping themselves thinking that they're, like, reading the news or, like, seeking out journalism, even though it kind of sounds like journalism and they believe it's true. Like, they're listening to it because they are entertained. And that's just kind of the power of really well told stories that exist kind of in the true crime world. And I think even with these podcasts that can be called journalism, like Grace was saying, that have rigorous fact-checking methods, that have a lot of people involved making sure that what the final product is as responsible as possible. When you put that research into the podcast format rather than the print format, you are starting to veer away from a lot of what we would consider to be, I think, the guardrails that exist in journalism. The way that we present information is going to always be different in podcasting. And I think the number one reason that is because it has to be delivered by a person's voice. You're going to center the journalist at the center of the story in a way that will never exist in traditional journalism. You're making yourself as a host kind of an important character in how people are understanding this information, which gives you a lot more trust from your listeners, and is, like, psychologically the reason that there's going to be all this excess bias coming out of how people are understanding this information. And then you don't even begin to talk about, like, the music that goes under a podcast, the sound effects. These are all things that are cueing us to think certain ways about the information we're listening to that there's no equivalent for that in print journalism. So I think even at its highest form, its most journalistic form, which for our project, we did all of our research as a journalism project, and we very much followed like very strict ethical standards for ourselves. And we had always intended to put this in the podcast format. And I think part of the meta research and the meta critique of this industry is there really is this like big difference in how you have to construct a story in the audio format, that will always be and sound and have kind of lasting effects that are very different from traditional print journalism, which is just kind of, I think, what people maybe are the least aware of between podcasting and print journalism.
Just going off of the discussion between podcasting, true crime podcasts, and journalism, Grace, in episode 6, in the last episode, you give some thoughts that I thought were really interesting. You kind of talk about the blurriness of the line that divides journalism and entertainment and what we're seeing in the true crime industry. We're going to listen to a clip of that right now.
Insert a clip right here. Do you want to read it, Dom, just so they know what it
Yeah.
is?
So, like, not only is entertainment now dressing up as journalism, journalism is dressing up as entertainment because that's how these organizations have to survive in the media ecosystem that we have now. So I'm just going to come out and I'll just ask this question.
All right.
So how does this then affect the trust that the public has in journalism? Does it affect it?
That is such a great question. I mean, I have to imagine, it can't not, is kind of my impulsive answer there. I think we've just seen such a degradation of trust, of public trust towards journalism on all axes in the last decade, that it's like it's hard to know how this sort of slots in. What I remember, and I think I was thinking about this as I was in that conversation from that clip, but my first experience with journalism, what kind of got me into this industry, was working for a small town weekly local paper when I was 16. That was my summer internship. And I loved it. It's print journalism in Northern California, in this small sort of tourist town. And I remember it was like sort of central casting, like surly newspaper editors, like old school guys in their Hawaiian shirts. And I remember they all came into to one of our staff meetings one day, and everyone was apoplectic because of a new report that had come out citing the number of Americans who thought they shouldn't have to pay for their news, that news ought to be free. And this was back in sort of 2016. And, you know, lots has changed in our media landscape since then. But I think already you could see this just sort of devaluing of journalism. I think the more that people start to get, yeah, I don't know, and that's probably what I would chalk it up to more than anything. Like this sense that it doesn't matter if I'm learning my information about the world from the Washington Post or from someone's TikTok account, not the Washington Post's TikTok account, which is actually very good, but like some random person regurgitating the news to me in a way that's much more entertaining and much faster and much more sort of absorbable than me seeking it out myself. Once we as consumers and as a sort of market became apathetic about that, I just think we sort of stopped understanding why journalism mattered. And I think that is part of the sort of degrading trust. Like if you don't understand the value of something, if you don't have a sort of like sanctity for and respect for journalism, then there's no, of course that relationship weakens. Like, of course that relationship degrades, because that, you know, not only does journalism need to serve the public, but the public needs to sort of serve journalism too. Like the public needs to value it and appreciate it. And I think this is all very, very high level, but some of what we're seeing with the preference for sort of true crime podcasting instead of crime journalism, and the sort of market preference and the clear audience preference for that, I think comes from, you know, this just for a long time we've sort of been encouraged to stop caring so much about the health and wellness of journalism, and I would probably say it's a symptom of that.
Yeah, and I think such a common trope in the way true crime creators tend to cover cases is this idea that traditional institutions failed to bring justice to the people at the center of these crimes. And that doesn't just include legal institutions. This includes traditional media institutions. Like the journalists covering this did not scream about it loud enough that we actually solved this case. And so we are the brave people coming in to like finally bring attention to this case. And I think that like allows people to trust true crime and podcasts and these voices we hear in our ears telling us the truth, quote unquote, about what actually happened a lot more than traditional institutions that should have taken this responsibility and fixed this issue a long time ago. So I mean, it's not just this implicit distrust that we're creating in traditional journalistic institutions. It's pretty explicit in I think a lot of these stories. But I think it's also just indicative of we're getting our information from different sources now. Like most of my friends and Grace's friends read our morning news through podcasts, not read, I guess, listen to our morning news through podcasts or social media. The way that we're consuming information is changing. And I don't know if the strategy should be to try to redirect people to traditional journalistic institutions. I don't know if that's like feasibly possible for all the people that are turning to TikTok and Spotify for their news, excuse me. I think what we hope for this project, I think the outcome of our own project is that there probably should just be really serious conversations within, say, the podcasting industry about how creator to creator and maybe the industry at large, the people that are distributing these podcasts can incentivize more ethical, more researched, more fact-checked products that are going out into the market to consumers. And from a consumer standpoint, just recognizing that what you're listening to is maybe not as journalistic or not as quote unquote true as you think it might be. We've highlighted for you all the ways that your own bias is created by listening to this content and the vastly different ways creators are putting this content into the world. So as a consumer, you can vote by your listens. You can help promote podcasts that are putting in the legwork to actually bring you as close to the truth as possible to report accurately on areas where it really matters that you're reporting accurately, like crime, things that are going to trial. This is really important that we're getting really accurate information out to the public about. And there doesn't seem to be that sort of urgency from consumers, and there doesn't seem to be that sort of urgency amongst creators, or at least any guardrails that are making sure people are actually holding themselves to that kind of accuracy standard. And I think that's just the conversation that we're hoping lasts much longer than our own research did.
Well, I definitely hope so. But one of the other things that, God, so many questions come to mind. And one of the big ones is, so for all of this, like, true crime, infotainment, maybe we can call it, etc. I'm wondering, what is the impact on the families? I mean, the people or the victims, the people who actually live through these experiences, are they finding that, the true crime podcast genre is perhaps helping a case of their loved one, or are they feeling exploited by the medium?
I mean, it can be both. And I think a lot of victim family members will go to these true crime fan conventions and they'll reach out to true crime creators because police have redirected resources away from their loved one's case, or they haven't been able to get traditional media institutions to pay attention to their case. And there's millions of creators out there who can help them get like their case to the public really quickly. And for a lot of people that will see, they will see some movement on their case. But I think the flip side of that, and what we've heard from talking to victim family members, is when they're putting their story out to the public like that, inevitably creators who they are not in contact with, people they've never reached out to, are going to pick up this case and make episodes about it, make money off their case without any sort of consent from victim family members. There's a lot of money flowing through the true crime podcasting industry. It's like the largest sector, one of the largest sectors of podcasting. And there are some people at the top of it making a lot of money doing it. Because people are really interested in these stories. And very rarely are you going to see any of that kind of monetary compensation for these cases go towards victim family members. And I'm thinking actually of kind of outside of podcasts. We were talking about the Menendez brothers case. The first season of Monsters was Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer case. And there was a lot of controversy about that adaptation because they adapted a lot of courtroom scenes from the Dahmer trial, which just kind of an interesting fact about when cases are filmed. The intellectual property of the story of the trial is owned by the company that films the trial, so like Court TV. So when like Ryan Murphy or someone wants to adapt that footage, like they're paying and they're buying the rights to that IP from whoever holds that video footage. You don't actually have to get the consent of those who gave testimony, the victims who gave testimony in trial. And so there's like this media is coming out without consent or even advanced knowledge from a lot of the people who are involved in this case. And I don't know specifically the details about that series and how much advance notice these victims were given, but there was a lot of outcry after that season premiered because of this issue. Like there is really no sort of incentive or guardrails making sure that creators are involving victim family members in how they're covering the case. And in fact, it's probably not always financially incentivized for creators to do so. And I think that's just one of the kind of tricky things about true crime because it can move cases forward. And I think victim family members feel like they're in this really tricky position because they want to bring attention to their case. They will always put themselves kind of in the harm's way of media in order to bring more attention to their case, hope their loved one's case gets solved. And I don't think the media industry, the podcasting industry treats these victim family members generally very well at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Oh, did you want to add something, Grace?
I'll just say quickly, I think to speak to the deviation between true crime podcasting and crime journalism is like on the family question with crime journalism, the involvement of the family would not be optional, right? It would be integral and central to your reporting process. Especially if you were sort of a local reporter covering like a local crime, like the family members and the loved ones would absolutely be like front and center in your storytelling process. And for the true crime podcasting industry, there is, again, none of that. There's no expectation that you even get the consent of the victim's family members or even the consent of the victim themselves if the person that you're talking about is alive to still tell their own story. Like you can tell, like, again, in the same way, imagine writing a profile about a person without the consent or involvement of that person and against their very wishes. Like it would be unheard of, or at least very, very difficult or very rare in the world of conventional journalism, but it's very common in true crime podcasting.
And then you have all of these issues within the industry of like people basically stealing content from each other, because very rarely people are going to the primary sources to get these original interviews, to talk to victim family members, to talk to people actually implicated in the crime. What they're doing is pulling from other podcasts who have already covered the crime, which then creates all this tension within the industry. Creators are very mad at each other. So there should be a conversation about how to actually, fix this industry, make it more ethical. We're not just like copying each other's podcasts or actually advocating for the victims like we say we are.
In your podcast, you're also bringing up this really good point. And Grace, maybe we'll start with you with this one. It's also the audience that true crime podcasts are targeting. And honestly, I think you brought up that 75% of the audience of true crime is the women. And It's so interesting what you found, why some of the draw is for that audience, and also, what is it that you found?
That is such an excellent question. And I think that is maybe the aspect of our project that is like, feels maybe most like, I don't know, I think this is one of the most profound parts of our own reporting, which that statistic that 75% of the audience is women comes from a researcher and an academic who did her dissertation on the phenomenon of domestic violence survivors listening to true crime podcasts. And I think what came through in her name is Kelly Bowling. She's a professor at, I think, the University of Nebraska. And I think what came through in Kelly's work is how pervasive the threat of violent crime is in women's lives, and how much stories about violence really kind of shape the female experience. Like we had another sort of true crime historian essentially tell us that the genesis of true crime was like mothers warning their daughters, this is what might happen. This is the big scary world, and this is what might happen to you. You know, if you go out late at night, or don't wear the right thing, or talk to the wrong people, or are just in the wrong place at the wrong time. So it's a very deeply female tradition, true crime, like well before the podcast, that dynamic has existed. Um, and yeah, I think the really hard truth that comes through when you look at the popularity of true crime podcasts for women in particular is just how culturally primed we are to expect violence on ourselves and onto our bodies, and to see our bodies as like threatened, like threatened, or potentially like vulnerable objects in the world. And again, I think true crime podcasts and their popularity with women are picking up on a sort of much like older dynamic, and like a much older truth about crime stories at large. Yeah, I don't know. It was really, and then again, it's part of why it makes it so hard to just fully condemn or write off true crime podcasting, because there are instances of people clearly finding that these podcasts are serving a really, really reparative function in their lives. And that is especially true for women. And it, in some cases, is especially true for women who have experienced violence themselves.
Yeah, and so you have this entire industry, which are mostly stories about women experiencing or being victims of horrible violence. And we're drawn to the stories that we see ourselves in. This is a psychological truth. And so I think the like almost 75% of the audience being true crime can be explained by the fact that probably well over 75% of the stories told in true crime podcasts are about women
Yeah.
as victims. But I think the other part of that is that's just not actually true about violence in our world. Women don't make up 75% of violent crime. They make up a much smaller percentage. In fact, the crimes that tend to be the center of true crime podcasts are these very kind of rare stranger killings. This idea that someone you don't know comes into your life and kills you all of a sudden one day, or does something horrible to you one day, which is obviously incredibly tragic and scary. And that's why I think the other part of why we're interested in these stories is this is terrifying to us, this idea that that could happen to any one of us. But that's actually not the reality of most violent crime. Most violent crime is going to happen to people who have much more violence in their life generally. Most victims, most female victims of violent crime and murder are going to be sex workers. And you very rarely see a sex worker at the center of a true crime podcast story. And I think that's a really tricky conversation to have about advocacy in this medium when we're not actually advocating for the most victims of violent crime in the US, especially. And so it's like kind of a both and. People are finding this sort of kind of cathartic experience listening to true crime, especially women. They're finding a lot of community. We have all of this kind of shared fear that something might happen to us. But I think it, I guess, puts a sour taste in my own mouth, this idea that creators are claiming to be trying to solve the injustices of our justice system. The, random woman killed by a serial killer is not really the true injustice of our justice system if we want to talk about kind of pervasive injustices.
Yeah.
I definitely say that's fair. Very quickly, because we're running out of time, but is there going to be a season 2, or was it a one and done situation?
We hope so. If anyone is listening and would like to pick us up for a season 2, we would like that very much.
Oh, well,
Um,
listen,
we,
hopefully.
we absolutely think there's more to the story to be told. We have lots of ideas, lots of excellent interviews that we didn't get the chance or the space to explore in season 1. I think we both feel like, yeah, there's definitely still a story to be told here. Um, and it will just sort of be, dependent on some sort of life circumstances supporting that, hopefully.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think
great stuff.
we're very pleased. Like we always intended this to be, I think, a limited series when we started the project. We feel like, at least with our 6 episodes, we brought a lot of our own research to a conclusion. We think that as it exists, you can listen to the True Crime podcast and understand this industry, I think, with more depth than existed before we started this research, and we're very happy about that. But I do think, yeah, I mean, we spent 18 months researching people and interviewing, and we have all this extra content we didn't use in this season. And every day, new things come out that are changing the way people are talking about true crime. We talked about the Menendez brothers series multiple times in this interview, and I think that's just a really good recent example of this. And so, yeah, already Grace and I have been working on kind of new projects that have sprouted from this series. I don't know that all of them will necessarily take form in the audio format, because true crime exists well beyond the audio format. We have, documentary, we have narrative fiction television. We also have a lot of print true crime. We have social media true crime. And I think we have conversations every day about how else can we kind of bring this research into the true crime space and tackle it from a new angle. So I guess the short answer is we don't know, but
Listen, that's perfectly acceptable, especially for any journalist to ask them a question about what's next and just I don't know. It's perfectly acceptable.
It turns out it's not up to us entirely, but
Well, I love the series. Just so you know, I thought it was great. You did a great job with it, and it was just so interesting. So
Thank
yes,
you so much.
and thanks for joining us and for chatting with us.
oh, this was
Very
incredible.
quickly, though, before we let you guys go, we do want to ask what drew you to this kind of work? We always ask all of our guests, why did you become a journalist? I feel like you guys are very much on your path to perhaps solidifying that, even if you're not necessarily sure. But what drew you to this work? And Grace, let's start with you.
Oh gosh, I was hoping you'd start with Kylie, but I can
I can shift over to Kylie. I mean,
what drew me? No. What drew me to this work? I'm just so interested by how we use stories to understand ourselves and how we use stories to understand our lives. And I think that what with the benefit of focusing on true crime is you are taking the most extreme, you're taking that sort of storytelling impulse and you're pitching it to its most extreme tenor. You're applying it to like the most extreme human experiences. But to me, what it unveils is just like this constant project that everyone is engaged in to like kind of um, understand and process and make sense of the world around them through stories. And I loved how much of this project was all about just like interrogating and being really, really curious about that human impulse.
Yeah. Look, I'm not a journalist. I am a writer who works in the entertainment media space. And so the most journalistic work that I've ever done has been with Grace, kind of echoing Grace's comment at the beginning of our interview with you. Like the reason I did this work was because of Grace. And approached this work in this way, in this journalistic way, is because of Grace. But I think Grace and I became friends, close friends in college, because we do have this same interest, which is understanding how stories help us understand ourselves. But I think we come at it from really different areas. Grace looks at it through this journalistic lens, and I've always been really drawn to entertainment media and how that represents stories about ourselves. And I think this project specifically about true crime was a really fascinating intersection of that interest from both of these spaces, because it is entertainment and it is journalism and it is kind of interrogating how these two mediums can be potentially the same product, or potentially a really dangerous disintegration of one or the other. And yeah, I'm very curious to see. I mean, Grace and I love to work together, and this has been a fascinating 18 months working on this project together. And I think there's a real future for our entertainment and journalism instincts to interact again.
In a much more ethical way than most true crime. I will add.
Well, thanks so much. Seriously, it's been a great conversation, and we look forward to seeing what you do next.
Thank you. And same to you both. I am so
Thank you.
excited that this podcast exists. Please keep it up, both of you.
Thank you.
It's a weird time to be a young
Yes.
journalist.
Oh.
And
Weird time to be an old one mid-career too. It's just weird for all of us.
Yes.
But I just, your work is very near and dear to my heart. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Laid Off and Looking is an independent podcast conceived of and created by Jenna Flanagan and Dominic Kemia. Music provided by Jay Cowett, research by Lori Ruthenbucker. Reach out to us anytime at laidofandlookingpod@gmail.com. New episodes drop every Friday at noon.